Hello, welcome to the First Responder HazMat Awareness Training. We'll be running through this section in two different videos, and at the end of the training, you will have a quiz available to you. The quiz goes over the basic stuff that we're going to talk about in these two levels of training, or these two videos, and you will have 3 attempts at that quiz, but you have to pass it with at least a 90% in order to get your certificate of completion. Now, this certificate of completion is going to be required along with your 2 FEMA courses, the NIMS 100 or the ICN 100 and ICN 700 level certificates. The 3 of those are required before you can take your National Registry EMT exam. So if you haven't gotten the other 2, then plan on getting those done. This one is going to require that you watch both videos and then take the quiz, and then your certificate will automatically print out for you. So I know hazardous material is probably not the most exciting topic, but we're going to try and get through this because it is important. If you happen to arrive on the scene of a hazmat incident, not knowing what to do could be detrimental to you, your crew, and ultimately your patients. And we have to keep you safe. So let's get into this. All right, our unit objectives for this first unit is to identify the OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, training requirements. Both of those are instrumental in how you need to be trained so that you meet the standards, the national standards. Okay. Secondly, we're going to identify the role of the awareness first responder. Now, for all intents and purposes throughout this training, that's going to be you, the EMS provider. So we're going to identify what your role is and make sure that you understand how to fulfill that role properly. And thirdly, we're going to identify the roles of your local emergency planning committee, and that's going to take on different bodies of people depending on where you're at in the country, and also the State Emergency Response Commission. So both of those agencies, your local and your state committees, are going to play an essential role on establishing how you are going to respond to a hazardous incident and how you are going to deal with that after the incident as far as reporting paperwork, etc. Okay, so let's look at hazardous materials. They're defined in numerous ways. 2 specific agencies are pretty instrumental in defining and controlling your hazmat substances. So the U.S. Department of Transportation is a major one because it is in their jurisdiction, the highways, the roads, railways, etc., that we transport these hazardous materials every hour of every day. And having an incident on one of those major public thoroughfares is catastrophic. So they are very forethinking and are very thorough in their definitions and requirements for transporting those. The other one is the Environmental Protection Agency. Obviously, if we would have a big spill, if you remember the big oil spill by the oil companies off of the coast, has caused a lot of not only national upheaval, but sometimes worldwide upheaval when we think about contaminating our waterways. And again, you know, the issues that we're dealing with on the pipeline that's possibly going through Nebraska. There's been a ton of issues there, and EPA is directly involved because it's important that we keep our land clean and free. So the other thing, and we've talked about them already, is OSHA. They control everything we do, especially in the health world. And so again, they do apply to the hazardous incidents because there's a huge safety factor there for the workers, the people involved, and also the responders coming in to help. So we're going to try and keep the definition simplified. This doesn't need to be a super large technical course, but you do need to know the basics. And you also need to understand that there are some extremely hazardous substances out there. Some are fatal upon inhalation, some are fatal upon skin contact. Others, although maybe not fatal, would be extremely debilitating, extremely painful, and may cause lifelong injury. And others, such as radioactive material, bring on a whole plethora of other issues that would be detrimental further down the line. So some of our hazardous incidents, like diesel fuel is a hazardous material. We kind of are all familiar with that. We know how to handle it. And on a scale of 1 to 10, it sits at maybe a 2 or 3 on the dangerous level. But that's not to say that all hazardous materials are that way. So just be aware that there's some very hazardous things out there, and you may come in contact with them without a moment's notice. Hazardous incidents are special. They require special equipment. They require special training. And typically, that equipment and that training is not available to first responders. So we're not prepared. We're not prepared educationally. We're not prepared to protect ourselves or anyone else. And we're certainly not prepared to venture into these things with this hero approach that we sometimes have. So this absolutely goes back to your scene safety issue. If the scene is not safe, don't go in. And if there's hazardous material on this scene, it is not safe. There's different mechanisms of harm when we're dealing with hazardous materials. So the team part of the team CPR acronym talks about some of those things, some of those ways we can be hurt. So thermal injuries, that can be burning, and we know from our EMT training that burns can come from several different avenues, can come from chemical, can come from heat, can come from steam, superheated air, superheated water. So heat is definitely a consideration when we're dealing with chemicals. Etiological, and that etiological basically means the source that it's derived from. So etiological deals with a lot of different, there's the point of origin is what etiological means actually. And so how that chemical is, where it originates from, has some definite impact on how it's going to harm us. Asphyxiation is another one, and asphyxiation basically means that the chemical you've come involved with is inhibiting your body's ability to take on oxygen and use it at the cellular level. So carbon monoxide is a great example of this. If you are inhaling carbon monoxide, it's going to attach to your red blood cells 200 times faster than oxygen will. So before oxygen even gets a chance to get into your bloodstream, the carbon monoxide has made those bonds with your hemoglobin, and it doesn't get off. It stays bound to that for several hours. So that would, even though there's oxygen in the air, if there's carbon monoxide as well, you are going to die from basically suffocation because you're unable to get oxygen to your body. There's lots of chemicals that operate that way. And then the mechanical would be that it would literally shut down or impair your body from functioning to stay alive. So maybe mechanically it's going to cause your body to lose fluid at a very rapid rate, which is going to keep it from staying alive if you lose all your fluid. Lots of different issues like that. We're not going to go into each of those. Just understand that there are some varying ways that chemicals can harm you. Now there are chemicals, the chemical issues themselves. Sometimes there are chemicals and gases, things that cause psychological issues. And some of those that, whether they're absorbed through the skin, whether they're inhaled, whether they're ingested, have mind-altering effects. So they may not directly affect your body, but they definitely will affect your mind and cause you to become impaired and possibly lose your functions or lose your life. And then the third one is radiological. We've touched on that just a moment ago. When we're talking about nuclear effects or nuclear blasts, radioactive material, that causes cellular mutations and can cause you effects, maybe not immediately, but down the road, and possibly alter your genetics and potentially be dangerous to other people as well. So lots to consider here. As EMS providers, you do have a duty to act. We've discussed this a lot in our first part of our EMT training. However, this takes on a little bit bigger meaning when, or a little different meaning when we talk about hazardous situations. Your duty to act is going to be defined by your employer's emergency response plan. So there should be a protocol or a standard operating procedure, an SOP, that would establish what your responsibilities are and absolutely define what you need to do in these types of situations. When you get a job as an EMT or you go to work as a paramedic, you need to find out what those are long before you're going to need to use them. And if they're not there, you need to start asking questions and find out where they are. Because it's very, very important that we never, ever exceed your level of training and protection. Okay. So the awareness level is, for all intents and purposes, what an EMS provider is going to be responsible for in a hazardous incident. Okay. These are the four things. Okay. And if you look, the first letters of these kind of have the acronym rest in peace, not. Okay. So we don't want you dying. So the R stands for recognition. So recognizing there's an incident. The I stands for isolation, isolating that incident as much as you possibly can while staying safe. Protection is not only protection for yourself, but other people that could be in the area. That does not include going into the incident and rescuing people that are directly involved. If you don't have the proper equipment for that, that is not part of your protocol. Okay? And then lastly, notification. Notifying those people that can go in and properly handle that situation, notifying law enforcement and getting the people there with you on scene that can help you control that incident and make it as safe as possible, as quick as possible. Okay, so the first thing in recognizing is going to be using your tools. Now, your North American Emergency Response Guidebook, I'll show you a picture of that on the next slide, is going to become your Bible for a hazmat response. Okay, every emergency vehicle should have a copy of it. I believe that is required by OSHA. And what this book is going to do for us, it's going to help us identify what material is involved. It's going to outline the actions that we need to take on scene. It's going to give us some protective action that we need to take for the area around the scene. And it gives us a safety plan to stay safe and keep others safe. Now, if you don't know how to use this book, I suggest you get your hands on one and take a look at it, because the day you need to use it is not the time to figure out how to use it. It's not hard to use, but you do have to be somewhat familiar. So the book looks like this. This is the latest copy, 2016. It is updated frequently, so I would suspect it seems like they kind of wait until there is a need. I think the last one was in 2012, so I wouldn't expect the next one until maybe 2020, something like that. Whoops, hold on here. Get all crazy. Okay, so legal mandates. The SARA Act of 1986 has a lot of jibber-jabberish in it, a lot of legal talk, but the two things that apply to us was that it mandated that OSHA develop safety regulations for first responders. So that brought OSHA in directly involved in our response to these incidents. And the second thing it did was required our local communities and facilities that have hazardous equipment to prepare for these hazardous emergencies. So communities being hospitals, fire departments, EMS agencies, and those types of things. Now, you may have had the opportunity already to participate in a hazardous incident exercise in which it's kind of a mock emergency where they practice bringing in people, how they're going to set up decontamination tents, what they're going to do, how are they going to shower these people, where are they going to keep the decontaminated people and keep them away from the ones that have been that are still contaminated. What are we going to do with the water once we wash these people off and that system? So if you have a chance to get involved in that, it's interesting and the detail that goes into it, there's a lot of things involved that you really don't think about it until you've been involved in that. So that was what the SARA Act of 1986 brought into this. SARA works directly with OSHA. OSHA's got its own set of codes. So the CFR 1910.120 and the EPA 403011, both are codes that deal with us. I'm not going to read those to you or go into those, but just know that there are legal mandates out there that are going to help drive and that we have to adhere to when we're responding to these incidents. Now there are 5 levels of training, and this is going to be important for you, especially if you intend to go into a fire service or are already on a fire department. So the first level is the awareness level. That's where you guys are going to be at as EMTs, at the awareness level. And that's what this course is about. Basically, you're going to be aware of an incident and know how to keep yourself safe. Operational level is the next one. There's more equipment involved, more training involved with that. Technician level, then the specialist, and then lastly, the incident commander. So as you go up and become more and more operational, up to the incident commander level, it requires more training, greater responsibility, and more understanding of how to respond and the chemicals that can be involved in your response. So the awareness and operational level, both of those take defensive actions. Okay, we're going to be on the defense, and our main goal is to stay safe and to keep others safe, period. Technician and specialists are the levels that take the offense. So they're not only going to be keeping people safe, but they're going to go into the situation and diffuse it and bring it down to a non-threat situation. And then lastly, the incident commander coordinates these responses, coordinates whose job is to do what, and is ultimately responsible for the safety of the entire incident. Okay. So in summary on this little bit, we talked about the definition and the differences of the different levels. We talked about the potential hazards and how we could be harmed by those. We discussed that we do have a duty to act, and that act for us is to keep ourselves and others safe. We talked about the 4 roles of awareness first responders, so that RIP not, R is recognize, I is isolate, P is protect, and N is for notify. We talked about looking at your employer's emergency response plan, the 5 levels of training, and then the 2 operational modes, the defensive and offensive modes that we would operate in. Okay, let's look at hazard identification very quickly. This is where you need to know what you're doing. Okay, so 6 clues. There are 6 clues that will kind of key us into the presence of hazardous material. I think I've had a stroke. I can't talk. There are various hazard classes for hazardous material. We're going to talk about each of those. There are 9. And then we're going to describe ways that you can determine the special identity of a hazardous material. So remember, this is part of our job, is to identify if we can. Okay, recognize, and part of recognition is identifying, isolate, protect, and notify. So our 6 basic rules to recognition. There are 6 things that we can use. Okay, occupancy and location. So where is it, and how many people are around? Okay, and that's going to help us. So there's a great difference if you're dealing with a let's say a pesticide spill out on a farm versus an entire tanker that has tipped over and ruptured on a busy interstate. Okay. Containers, shapes, and sizes will give us clues. Placards and labels on the containers will help us. Shipping papers and facility documents will help us to identify. And markings and colors of the containers sometimes will help. And our human senses, we can't ever discount those too much. So let's talk about these. Okay, first clue is looking at the occupancy or the general area. How populated is it? Where are the people around? What exactly are you dealing with as far as potential exposure and where you're at? Does the area lend itself to having hazardous material in it? We talked about a farm a second ago. Farms absolutely have hazardous materials on board. Now, if you're responding to a gas station, there are hazard material there. Whereas if you're responding to a grocery store or a small farm home kind of out in a rural, maybe not so much. So looking at where you're at in the general area. Fixed facilities. When you're responding to a building of sorts, what kind of building is it? What kind of business is it? And that's going to help you identify businesses that potentially have hazardous materials around and those that maybe not so much. We're going to think about transportation and the 5 modes that we transport our hazardous chemicals. Those would be by rail car, so trains absolutely, by air, typically not so much on passenger airlines, but cargo airlines absolutely will be transporting hazardous materials from time to time. Marine, on the boats, we've already talked about the offshore oil, but that doesn't mean that that's the only part. There could be hazardous materials transported in this area by barge. Highways and interstates are a huge mechanism for transporting hazardous materials, and then pipelines also. And then lastly, unfortunately, we have to consider drug labs. And this makes it a little more difficult because those really can pop up in very obscure and not very well advertised areas. So one thing that I will mention right here for this, because I don't want to forget it, there is a large uptake in chemical suicides, and some of those chemical suicides consist of people locking themselves in their car. Sometimes they put notes on the door, but not always, and they will put dangerous gases inside the car. One of them that I'm familiar with is chlorine gas, and that can be made very easily by mixing bleach and ammonia together. It is a fatal gas. If you breathe it, it will kill you. But if the person is attempting suicide, they can accomplish that. But if chlorine gas is inside the vehicle, you respond to the vehicle and open up the door, you will inhale that chlorine gas. And I can tell you from personal experience, that is dangerous, It will cause damage, and it will knock you down, if not knock you clear out in a very short period of time. So think before you leap on some of these, because sometimes the scene that looks safe is not. So let's talk about container shape and size. This is our second way that we can get clues. There are portable containers and then fixed and transport containers. So you can tell from the three of these all three have a different purpose, but they all contain hazardous materials. So we want to, it could be from a large tank on a facility, not necessarily a going down the road tank, but a large storage tank, all the way down to barrels and containers, all the way down to bottles. Okay. We want to think about our containers. Are they pressurized? And if they are pressurized, is it low pressure or high pressure? That the higher the pressure, the more dangerous the situation is. Sometimes you may not know, but you could probably assume in a glass bottle it is probably not pressurized. 55-gallon drums are generally not pressurized. Tankers, entirely different story. If you've got gases, oftentimes those are highly pressurized gases in there to condense them into liquid form for transporting purposes. So look at that and think through that, or get some more information before you jump in. The last thing is the BLEVE, and BLEVE, that BLEVE, stands for Boiling Liquid Expanding Vapor Explosion. So this is an explosion caused by the rupture of a vessel containing a pressurized liquid that is above its boiling point. Now, each liquid has different boiling points. Like, for instance, methyl bromide has a boiling point of 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that's just slightly above freezing, but that is the boiling point for that. So if it is a pressurized liquid, oftentimes if they pressurize it, then the boiling point changes. But once the pressure is off, this thing can reach boiling point very, very quickly as soon as the pressure is released. Consequently, on the other end of the stick, we've got methanol, which is wood alcohol, and the boiling point for that is 151 degrees. So we don't really have to worry about that, nor will it probably be pressurized. So sometimes when those pressurized tanks rupture, then we end up with that explosion, which becomes very dangerous. Okay. Clue number 3 are the placards and labels that we could find. You see some examples over here on the side. We're going to talk about each of those. Placards are not always required. Okay. Generally, as a rule of thumb, if dangerous material, hazardous material is being transported, they will have placards on the vehicle that transport them. However, we have the 1,000-pound rule. So this 1,000-pound rule says that some hazardous materials shipped by ground, and this only applies to ground shipment, and are less than 1,001 pounds don't require placards on the vehicles. And if you think about this, if you've got a Walmart truck and he's got a case of spray paint, that technically is a hazardous material, but is a case of spray paint enough to placard the entire vehicle? And so the DOT says no, less than 1,000 pounds, we're okay. Now for us responding, if your vehicle is on fire and you've got some hazardous material involved, that could change the whole dynamics of your call. So just because there's no placards does not mean that you're free and clear of hazardous material. The placards and labels used for transport are based on DOT hazard classes. There's 9 of those hazard classes. They're subdivided into different divisions, and you can find all of those on page 11. Well, I'm not sure what page it is of the 1996 ERG. If we update that, but look in the first few pages and you'll find a list of these classifications. Okay. So the first class is explosives. Okay, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. There are 6 subsets to this. So 1.1, and you'll see like down here on this bottom one is 1.1, is a mass explosion hazard. So that's going to be the most dangerous, is that 1.1. 1.2 is projectile hazards. 1.3 is fire, minor blasts, or projectiles. Okay. 1.4 is a minor explosion hazard. 5 is very intensive, and 6 is extremely insensitive. So 5 and 6 are fairly benign, but 1.1 is much more so. These placards are always orange. They're always diamond shaped like that, and they usually say explosives on them somewhere. Okay. These are pretty unified, so what you see here is generally what you're going to see on the side of a truck or a rail car. Class 2 are gases. Okay, these can be pressurized or liquefied. So like compressed nitrogen and liquefied petroleum gases are examples of how these might be hauled. The product containers present hazards. So 3 subdivisions of this are flammable gases, non-flammable, non-poisonous gases, and then poisonous gases. Okay, so we have our flammables, which are red. That's noted by the flames at the top. Non-flammable are in the green. And then your toxic gases, the skull and crossbones, are the universal sign for poisoning. Okay. Class 3 is your flammable and combustible liquids. These can be ignited at room temperature. So combustible liquids require some degree of preheating to ignite. So if you see these flammable liquids, your number one rule is to eliminate ignition sources. So if you're on the outskirts of this scene, you want to make sure that traffic is away, that there's, if there's power lines coming in, that you contact the utilities and get the power shut off. If there's sources of ignition such as pilot lights, things like that, that you get those addressed and find a way to get those put out. So for example, I'm going to use propane for this. Propane, although as a gas it doesn't really fit in this category, is low and heavy and it sits low. So if it's in the basement and you've got your gas water heater in there or your gas furnace, you have a pilot light. You have a very high risk of an explosion should that propane meet up with that igniter. So maybe you would want to find a way to shut off the propane from the outside, which would turn off your pilot lights and lessen that risk of exposure. Okay. Hazard class 4 are flammable solids. Okay. There's 3 categories for these: flammable solids, spontaneously combustible solids, and dangerous when wet solids. Those all have different properties. We're not going to spend a ton of time on these because there's so many of them to go over. But you can see that they all have the class 4 on their placard here. They have different numbers. They do all have the flame because they're flammable. And somebody that's astute in reading these signs will know what these different colors mean. Okay, but it's spelled out pretty clearly when you look at this. Okay. Class number 5 are oxidizers and organic peroxide. Okay, oxidizers release oxygen to enhance or intensify burning. Your oxygen will fall into this category. Okay, with strong fuels, oxidizers can create conditions which can lead to violent combustion. Oxygen obviously isn't the only one in here, but when you add a fire or fuel that's already burning and then you add an oxidizer to it, it's a bad combination. And then organic peroxides, there are several different types of those, but they typically are pretty unstable. So you can look in your ERG and find out examples of those. Class number 6 is going to be your poisonous and infectious substances. I think poisonous speaks for itself. It's dangerous and harmful to our bodies. That can include irritating substances all the way to tear gas, things that are going to take us down and inhibit our body's ability to function. Infectious substances can be human blood. This is where our red biohazard bags come in, and our bio containers will fall into this category. Sometimes this category 6 rectangle or the diamond shape is red, and we'll see this symbol with the 4 circles on our biohazard containers, and those containers are usually red too. So these represent a potential disease in humans. It also includes anthrax, human blood, and other body fluids. Class number 7 is our ginormously attractive radioactive materials. Exposure to these does not always result in contamination, but you don't know until it's too late oftentimes. So radioactive material are ionizing, so they genetically alter our cellular and our DNA. And so getting your DNA altered is a big thing, and we don't want to go there if there's any way around it. Safety rules for this: radioactive substances will subside with time, depending on what type of radioactive rays you have, and how much will depend on how much time. They will travel a distance, so if you have a radioactive emergency, in this particular neck of the woods, probably our biggest concern would be our nuclear power plants. And I think we've all been somewhat familiarized with the dangers involved with that. If there is a breach of protection with those radioactive rays will travel quite a distance and cause a great deal of harm to both the vegetation, the aqua life, and human life. So shielding is going to involve getting yourself in a place. Oftentimes being in your ambulance in this type of situation will not be enough. Shielding for radioactive requires lead barriers or significant amounts of ground between you and the radioactive waves. These containers are shipped in specialized containers and are typically very secure and will withstand quite a bit of injury before they become damaged and leak. Class 8 is your corrosive hazards. Okay, these are basically materials that cause destruction to human skin or tissue, or a liquid that has a severe corrosion rate on steel. I would say if it's going to corrode steel, humans might be at risk also. Okay. These are where a lot of your acids and things come in. Okay, and class 9 hazardous material are your miscellaneous, so dry ice, lime, asphalt, battery parts, consumer commodities. That may be where your spray paint and that type of thing comes in. Hazardous waste will come in here, and they're typically marked with the number 9 and then the black and white stripes. Okay, so along with placards, we can look at labels to see what we're dealing with. Okay, now if you're close enough that you can read the label, yay. A lot of what we're going to be looking for is going to be through binoculars. So if you don't have a pair of binoculars in your squad or your response vehicle, you need to consider getting those, because you don't want to have to get close enough to read that placard on that tanker before you realize that you're in danger and back up. You need to stop when you're a distance away, be able to use your binoculars and recognize these things. Labels, probably we're not going to see with binoculars, but it's definitely a way that we can recognize. So on the label, we're looking for the product name, the active ingredients, and then signal words that we're looking. So caution, danger, poison, warning, all of those things will be key triggers. We need to go right there and look and see what that says. Now this particular one says, see the back panel booklet for additional precautionary statements. That would be the next place I would look if I happen to have this in my hand. Okay. This is typically going to be more on a small scale response that we're responding to an individual or maybe a small group of people. Clue 4, or our fourth clue that we can look for, are shipping papers and facility documents. Okay, so over here under the mode column, this first column talks about where we may find these things on a railroad, a highway, airline, pipeline, where the papers are going to be. As these chemicals are being transported, they always are accompanied by paperwork that will give us good information to know what it is and how to handle it. So in a railway, it's called a waybill or a consist, and those papers are always going to be with the railroad crew. So if you arrive on scene and you've got a derailed train, you want to find the crew as quickly as you can, and as long as you have to go into the dangerous area, the hot zone, and see if you can find that paperwork to find out what is on those cars. On the highway, typically in trucks, you're going to find a bill of lading. That's what it's called. This is going to be in 3 places. It'll either be with the driver. Okay, if the driver gets out in an incident, he is instructed to take that. The other 2 places he could legally have those, would be on the driver's seat. So if he gets out of the truck, he can lay the bill of lading on the driver's seat. So that would be a good first place to look. Secondly, if it's not in the driver's seat, there's a pocket on the inside driver's door. That bill of lading most oftentimes is going to be right in there. Now it may be in a binder, a folder, a clipboard, but it should be right there. And that will tell you what is in that shipment, and then you can look in your emergency response guide to figure out how to deal with that. On the airlines, it's going to be called an air bill, and that is always with the pilot. And on a pipeline, it's going to be called a marker, and those are going to be at the crossroads with other modes of transportation. So where the pipeline crosses the highway, those will be marked on both sides. Where the pipeline crosses or goes under a railroad, that will be marked at both sides. So you can always look there for the information you need there. Otherwise, on a fixed facility, you're going to have what we call the Material Safety Data Sheets, or MSDS sheets. These are required to be maintained by the Federal Hazard Communication Standard, and in Florida they have their own special law for this. They're found at all fixed facilities, so you're going to find these in hospitals, you'll find them in warehouses, you'll find them in factories, any place that has that equipment. Now if you work in a hospital, you're going to find you have to have an MSDS sheet for most of your cleaning equipment. So if you've got bleach on board, you're going to have an MSDS sheet in that facility somewhere that outlines the specific data of, about the bleach. Okay, and then there will be a variety of information on those, including the emergency response plan and the emergency action plans for dealing with those materials in that facility. So this takes it just a step farther. They have to be able to document how we're going to treat that incident if there's an incident with that particular chemical. This is a copy of an MSDS sheet. So you can see here it talks about, here's going to be your placard guidelines about it. Here's going to be the manufacturer, all of that stuff about where it's manufactured, phone numbers to contact them, and emergency phone numbers. And then down here is your emergency identification stuff. So the components, what it is, what numbers it are, what it's made out of, the hazardous ingredients that are involved, and the physical chemical characteristics are in section 2. So if there's a boiling point, that's listed. If it's a melting point, what point it vaporizes, does it soluble in water or not. And then section 3 is probably going to be very important for us, the fire and explosion hazards that are associated with that chemical. Okay. So, Clue number 5 will be markings and colors. Unfortunately, there's not a lot here, so containers and colors are not always standard, or container colors are not always standardized. But they do have numbers, and the UN and NA, so UN is United Nations, NA is North American identification numbers. Now, those numbers are the same. It's just sometimes they're labeled UN if it's an international number, or North American if it's something that's originated here on our continent. But those numbers, regardless, are identical. And those are going to be listed on the NFPA, that's the National Fire Protection Agency, 704 Diamond, and I'll show you that. There's also military markings. If you're familiar with the military, you'll have those and know what those are. But here's what's typical for most hazardous material here in the United States. This is the National Fire Protection's Diamond, and so oftentimes you see these on the sides of trucks and rail cars. And what you're going to have is the red is a fire hazard, the blue is a health hazard, the yellow is a reactive hazard, and then if there's a specialty issue, it will be listed in white. Okay, so if it's a 0, like if the health hazard down here has a 0, there is no hazard there. The higher the number, the higher the hazard. So, if you're dealing with a number 4 up here in the red, you're going to have a high fire hazard with that marking. And so sometimes if you can just see the color and the number through your binoculars, you'll be able to specifically identify what's going on with that shipment without having to get very close. Okay, and then the last clue is going to be our human senses. Okay, so going from high to low, our risk levels. Taste. If you can taste a chemical or something, there's a pretty high risk here, because our taste means that you've absorbed that into your body somehow and you're now tasting it. So dimethyl sulfoxide, I have to say this slowly, penetrates the skin very quickly, and it absorbs with any chemicals that are with it. So sometimes this is used as a poisoning agent for people, but you can taste it. It tastes metallic. Other things are mercury and lead exposures. You can taste those. Obviously, both of those are very bad. So if we can taste, then you're way, way, way too close and you need to back up. Touch, if it's itchy on your skin, burning on your skin, irritating to your skin, then back up. And you have been exposed and you're too close. Smell is kind of in the middle there. It's still dangerous. Ammonia, propane, natural gas, chlorine, all of those things have a very distinct smell on purpose to keep us safe. So if you're smelling an odd smell, you're probably entirely too close, and you need to back yourself and everybody else up. Okay. Sight, typically we can see farther than the danger is. Now, it doesn't mean if you can see it, you're out of danger, but sight would be, looking for things like ruptured containers. You can sometimes see gases in the air. They kind of have that wavy appearance. Sometimes you have gases that are kind of a greenish or yellowish tinge to them. Sometimes you can see that animals are in distress, or vegetation is starting to wilt, or there are maybe people down in that area. And that would be all those would be very good clues to stay the heck away. And then sounds will travel quite a ways. So explosions, we could hear an explosion from quite a distance away without being in danger. Other things that may not be quite so easy to hear and might be a little more dangerous is if you hear gases leaking, if you hear that high-pitched whistling, or you hear humming or sizzling sounds. Other things that we need to think about listening for are shouts from people, and moaning and groaning, things that may be coming from people that are wounded. And so using our senses, all of our senses all the time, will help us stay safe. Okay, so once you recognize it, we need to try and identify it. And again, we've talked about using your binoculars to do this. So if we can locate the material name, then we know where to start looking in our emergency response book. Shipping papers, MSDS sheets, facility pre-plans, employees, bystanders sometimes can help you identify what's there. If you can't safely identify, try to classify the material into a hazardous class. So if you don't know what it is, don't go in looking, but your next best thing is, can you put it in a hazard class? Can you look at the placard and tell it it's red, which means it's probably flammable? And so looking at your emergency response guidebook will help you with that. If you can't identify it, then please don't put yourself at risk. Please don't. And let somebody that can identify it go in closer. So summary for this, we've learned to recognize, classify, and identify different types of chemicals. Okay. We've learned the 6 clues to recognizing if there's hazardous materials on scene. So that's where are we and what are the potentials within this area of having hazardous material. Are there containers and what shape and size are they? Are there any placards and labels available to us? Do we have access to shipping papers and MSDS sheets? We're looking at markings and colors on the containers and sheets, and then we're using our senses to guide us in that. There are 9 general classes of hazardous material. Okay. That is it for this section. So we will end this and pick up again in part 2. Thank you for joining us.